Okay, I think we can get started. So let me just say good afternoon to everyone. My name is Kevin Riley, and I'm with the Emergency Management Department here at Stony Brook University Hospital. Just a couple of administrative notes to get started. I just want to make sure that each of our audience members joins the presentation with their cameras turned off and make sure that they're muted. Also, anyone wishing to have their attendance recorded for the session, we can do that. Just need you to provide your name and email in the chat window. And I'd also like you to send me a follow-up email at the conclusion of the discussion. That'll help make sure we get everything documented. I'd like to sincerely thank all of you for joining our presentation today on mass casualty incident preparedness, which I dare say is a noble obligation for all of us tuning in. On a personal note, I just have to say what a privilege it is indeed to associate with our esteemed panelists and with each and every one of you in our audience. We're going to focus our attention today on the active shooter event that took place at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida on the afternoon of February 14th, 2018. To date, this is the deadliest high school shooting in our country's history. Sadly, it is one that left 17 people dead and another 17 people injured. And I think one can only guess at the untold emotional toll from the event. The one common denominator of all these profound and appalling attacks is the dark cloud that they cast over the entire American landscape. So we shall endeavor today to uncover whatever silver linings may exist in the Parkland cloud in particular, not the least of which is that every life that could be saved on that day was in fact saved. So that is indeed a silver lining. Today's discussion is one in a new monthly series of MCI case study reviews that are designed to enhance the medical surge capabilities of both pre-hospital care providers as well as those who serve in the hospital setting. So our goal today is to understand some of the more salient lessons learned from both an individual perspective as well as an organizational standpoint. And I think we can best do that by hearing from those who were there that day. So we'll first examine the challenges and the challenges at the crisis site and the initial sequence of the response. And then we hope to work our way through the entire continuum of patient care all the way through the hospital setting. That said, we are extremely fortunate today to have with us three of the key responders who truly rose to the occasion during the Marjory Stoneman Douglas incident, all of whom directly treated the victims and all of whom are rightly credited with saving 17 lives that day. By all objective standards, our panelists are heroes, one and all. So to share their stories and how the incident unfolded and some of the key lessons learned, we have with us today Deputy Chief Mike Moser of the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department. We have Dr. Peter Intevi, Medical Director of the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department. Both were on scene that day, both treated victims and ran the scene. And a little later on in the presentation, at approximately around 2 o'clock, we'll also have Dr. Evan Boyer join us in our discussion. And Dr. Boyer is an emergency department physician who treated many of the victims at Broward Health North Hospital, which is located just about 11 miles from the scene. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us today. We have about approximately 90 minutes that could probably take an entire day to tell the story, but we're limited on time. So we're going to focus what precious time we have on what mattered most to the both of you and also to Dr. Boyer. So I think it's worth telling our audience this is not just a retelling of what people may have heard in the media or what they may have read in an after-action report. What we're in search of today is really just a few pearls of wisdom, from those who were actually there. And maybe we'll all discover some techniques that we may wish to include among our own skill sets. So we will have a question and answer opportunity towards the end of the session. So if any of the audience has a question they'd like to ask our panelists, you can type it into the chat. Time permitting, we'll do our best to provide you with an answer. And if we get limited on time, if we get too limited on time for any reason, then I invite you to just email me directly. You can send your question to me and I'll do my very best to find an answer for you. So before we dive in too deeply, and setting aside the events of that day for just a moment, I'd like to ask our two panelists to just take a minute to share with us a little bit about their background, a little bit about themselves, so we can just get to know our estimable panel from a more personal perspective. Chief Moser, if you wouldn't mind, maybe we'll just start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us. I can tell you, Dr. Intevi and I have spoke about this subject many a times in a lot of different groups, and it's an important job for us to make sure that we can bring this back to any group that'll listen to us, because we definitely want the intent of this session and this presentation to be lessons learned. Obviously, not everything was done perfectly. There was a lot of stuff that was done well, and again, that's why we're here. So thank you for having us. My name is Mike Moser. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief of Support Services for the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department. At the time of the event, a little bit over 3 years ago, I was a Division Chief of Administration and happened to be the first arriving chief officer on the scene of Douglas that took command of the incident and retained the command role for the remainder of the incident. I've been with the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department for 20 years, obviously starting out as a firefighter EMT and working my way up through the ranks and eventually attaining paramedic and working up to where I am now. I live in this community. I have lived here my whole life, and I find that obviously important to be involved with the community, not just during the incident, but after. My wife is a captain with the agency here. I have 2 kids at home, and I really, I mention that because just like Dr. Intevi, we are part of the community. We have children that go to school here, and it's something that maybe even one of the other reasons why we continue to do what we do in the community and talk about this event. So that's really it for me. Doc?
Right. Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Kevin, for having us. My name is Peter Antevi. I'm trained as a pediatric emergency medicine physician and been doing that for over 20 years. And then about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, became involved as an EMS medical director and board certified in EMS. And it's just been, a wonderful experience being affiliated with such a wonderful department, people like Chief Mosier and many others who really made this event, I think the outcome as tragic as it was, really, I think there are many learning points that we do like to share, so that God forbid it happens in your location. Perhaps you can learn from what happened with us. I'm from South Florida originally. My wife actually was the first graduating class from MSD, so we have very strong ties there. And every time I get a request to speak on this, it is very difficult to say yes. I have to admit, only because several of the families who lost children, I know them personally. Went to high school with one of them. So this is really the first event that, out of all the death that we see in EMS and in emergency medicine, this is the first one that really affected me personally, emotionally, for quite a while. And the department really came through for me in more ways than one. So it is tough for me to tell the story, but I do see how important it is to help others. So thanks for having us, Kevin.
Absolutely, gentlemen. It's a real pleasure, and I think our audience appreciates it very much. This is a truly invaluable experience here, and so thank you again. So now we'll talk about the event itself, and we'd like to do that both from a personal vantage point and perhaps also from an organizational perspective. So we'll delve into our first question. It's really a two-part question, really. First, I'd like to ask each of you to share with us where you were that day and maybe what your initial thoughts were when you suddenly realized that this wasn't going to be just another day. And then secondly, I'd like to ask each one of you to sort of delve into your specific role at the scene. And I'll ask Dr. Bory what his role was at the hospital. And I'd like to understand the critical role that your organizations played. So again, how did the day begin for you? You know, what were your initial thoughts? And then we'll talk about the role that you played and your organization. So Chief, if we could start with you, that would be great.
You know, I don't want to sound cliche, but it started as a normal day. You know, I'm in the office. Actually, at the time that this call came in, I was in dispatch, which is on the third floor of our building here, when the call started coming in, and I was in an office, and I remember somebody coming in and saying that there was a shooting at the high school. The information was sketchy, to say the least, at the beginning. I didn't know that this was an active shooter per se, but as soon as the incident seemed to be somewhat credible and serious, I literally, probably for the first time in many years, ran down the stairs of the building and didn't even hit the elevator, just ran down the stairs. And as I ran past our fire administration office, I mentioned to my supervisor and the fire chief who was here that there was a shooting at the high school, and I don't even remember what they said, and I just continued out the door and jumped in my truck and responded fairly quickly to the scene. As the information was coming in over the radio, you know, I don't really know if there was a time that I thought to myself, this is the real deal, or whether that information just kept piling up, you know, until I got there. Because when I did arrive, it was the proverbial ghost town there. You know, I was expecting tumbleweed to be going across the street because it was so quiet there. The information that was coming over the radio sounded so serious and critical, and yet when we arrived, there was nothing there. There was lines of cars there to pick up their kids in the afternoon because it was dismissal time. There was nobody running around. There was nobody doing anything outside of the ordinary. I was there. I established command very quickly as soon as I arrived. And even though it seemed like a ghost town there, I did start to, in my head, remember all the times that I had, either as a driver operator of a fire truck or on a rescue vehicle, or as a supervisor or battalion chief, those command structure processes that need to be set up. So I parked my vehicle. You actually have the slide up on the screen here. Just to the right of that, I think you might be able to see the tail end of a vehicle. That's my vehicle. I pulled up in an area where I thought it was going to be safe to run the command structure, and in an area where that was far away from the building enough, but close enough to be able to communicate with the crews that were coming in and out, and also the groups that I was going to be setting up. Very shortly after I established command and began to set up the units that were incoming, even prior to seeing our first patient, I got on the radio and declared a level 1 MCI, which is 5 or more patients, but not to exceed 21, just to get some additional resources started. We began to line trucks up in the road in a manner that they could easily have ingress and egress out of the scene. The last thing we want to do is bottleneck trucks in the roadway. When my EMS chief arrived on scene, I immediately gave him the medical branch designation to ensure that he was going to manage all things medical, whether that be triage, treatment, transport, and all of those things that come with that. And really the basics, and I know we're going to talk a lot about this, you know, moving forward, but really the basics of the incident command structure and the incident management system model has to be put into place early, and it was, and I'm obviously thankful that we were able to do that. And you know, as the incident progressed, as we started to now get patients, which, you know, the first couple were brought to the scene by school staff on golf carts. They were from all over the school. You know, we're going to talk about where this building is located and where a majority of the patients were located, but all of the shooting took place at the 1200 building. which is an isolated location within the school. However, these patients were delivered to us in various means. Some walked, some were carried, some were brought in golf carts. And again, that process was methodical, and it was by the book. And again, too, we'll talk, as we progress, and if I don't bring it up, please remind me, but the training that's necessary for this type of event, ironically, was had in our agency just weeks prior to this event. And we'll talk about that kind of training and what we've done, not only before, during, and after the event, but really how we've carried that torch. And not just our agency, but really all over the country, we've carried this torch of this active assailant program and how important it really is. The incident had times of chaotic time evolution, and then there was times during the event where nothing was going on, and it seemed as if this was just a drill at some points because of how it was progressing through the afternoon. There's a lot of factors involved in incidents like this. There wasn't just the patients, there was screaming parents and screaming adults and police officers all over the place, and helicopters and news media, and so much really that we don't really train for or take into consideration on our day-to-day events. But I can tell you that these are all things that really need to be planned for ahead of time. And again, I know the outline of our discussion today, I know we're going to talk about a lot about that stuff, but it's important to mention how critical the process has to be before this event takes place. We could argue all day long that the chances of this happening in your jurisdiction are very slim. We said the same thing prior to this event happening here. So
it's low probability, but very high consequence.
Absolutely. So as far as the progression of the incident that day, that's kind of how it went. And I don't want to get too far into the incident, because I know we're going to talk about some specifics in there, but that's kind of what brought us up to kind of the meat and potatoes of the event so far.
Chief, if I can, just a little follow-up on there. So you mentioned that the scene was relatively quiet when you arrived. At some point, you had to link up with law enforcement, at least from a coordination and communication perspective. Was law enforcement on scene when you arrived? And at what point did you link up with law enforcement? Was it a doctrinal unified command, as we like to say in ICS?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And this is going to be one of those things we talked about. We talk about lessons learned. There are some things that are going to be lessons learned, and I'll get to your question in a second, but there are going to be things that are going to be lessons learned, keeping in mind, though, that not all of them are negative in nature. And even the things that we didn't do right, I also don't want to make an excuse for why they weren't done, but there are some times where there are good reasons why things aren't done. And to follow up with your question, here's why. Very early on in the incident, on the Broward Sheriff's Office radio channel, they asked for a fire department representative to meet them. That message never made it to us. Several times during my communications to my dispatch, I asked for a police representative to come to our command post because ours was set up first, and I thought that would be a good idea. That message never made it to the sheriff's office. So, and even when the messages were delivered, those people who, on the law enforcement side, who would have been responsible for commanding that scene, were guns drawn out at the scene, handling not only the search for the shooter, but physically carrying bleeding children out of the building. So, in a perfect world, that unified command would have been set up very early on in the incident. But to be fair, there are times when even how many times you train for that or know what the right thing to do is. In our situation, it just didn't happen for a number of unforeseen reasons that, again, I don't want to make like I'm sounding excuses for, making excuses for, but they didn't happen just because they didn't happen. But it's
Right.
not for a lack of trying, and it's not for a lack of the police and or us not knowing that was something that needed to be done.
Right. There's certainly this fog of war concept going on. And I'm wondering how long it took before the responders established that the crisis was limited just to building 1200. Was there a period of uncertainty as to where the extent, the geographic extent of the crisis, or how quickly did you know it's building 1200?
So immediately when the calls started coming in, hats off to anybody who called from the school or even from outside the school. Building 12 was on the radar from the very beginning. We knew that's where the shooting was taking place. And I don't care how good you pre-plan the buildings in your area. Building 12 wasn't readily understood by almost anybody on scene, maybe other than the school resource deputy who was there and who works there every day. I believe, in my opinion, that even maybe the deputies or fire personnel that work in that zone maybe don't even know what building is there at a school of that large, and you'll see it in some of your presentations. There's an overall view of what the school looks like. It's a big area, and there were some times during the incident where there was false information that was broadcast about it possibly being in another building. But I think for the most part, we knew right away where that was, meaning where the calls were coming from and where the shooting was taking place. But again, even knowing where that building is compared to where we were located caused some issues for us.
Sure. Speaking of location too, I'm right in saying that the corner of Holmberg and Coral Springs Drive was the casualty collection point, and also that was the location also of your command post as things kicked off.
It was. Coral Springs Drive actually turns into Pine Island Road right when it crosses north of the Sawgrasses, which is where the school is located. So if you have anybody looking it up, they might see it's a Pine Island Road. But when I arrived on the scene, I was looking for something away from yet still close to the school, and there was a nice open little area there on that corner where I pulled my vehicle. And the reason I put medical there was for that same reason. There is a lot of times when you can co-locate some of your groups together. And when the EMS chief arrived and I put him there, it just seemed like a logical location, not only because there was an open field there to do treatment, but because the way that the trucks were coming and going to the scene, they could have very easily drove directly next to that corner of the intersection, picked up a patient, and gone east on Holmberg Road, and the next major intersection they would have hit would have taken them to the highway, which would have then taken them to the trauma center. So a lot of these things are second nature. Not blocking fire trucks and rescue vehicles in the roadway needs to be something that's thought of very early on, and those were things that, again, fortunately for us, we were able to remember those things because of the training that we had just recently, just prior to the event.
Gotcha. I'm sure you also activated mutual aid partners. I'm curious as to how many ambulances did you have on scene throughout the operation, and was that a sufficient number?
I'm going to pull up a slide over on my side here of a presentation that we did that talks about how many trucks were there, and there was a lot. But as this incident unfolded, there was always enough units there at the time, at the need of, as the patients arrived. And at the same time, it almost seemed as if there was not enough trucks there, because you have to remember, when your vehicles are there to either treat or transport patients, sometimes you need more than just the truck itself. You need the people that are on those trucks. So as we call our rescues down here rescues, but in some agencies they call them ambulances. They're staffed with firefighter paramedics. As our rescues arrived on scene, I didn't need their truck, I needed them. So in order to staff the treatment location, I needed several trucks worth of people to do that. So the first two or three trucks that were there, but they weren't there in a transport capacity, which again worked out fine, because as those patients were ready to be transported off the scene, we had additional trucks arriving, not just from our agency, but from neighboring agencies. Although we're not on the same dispatch system as some of our neighboring agencies are, we still have a very quick way to get those units to the scene. And we were fortunate enough to have trucks and staff personnel from all over the county at our scene. And so there wasn't so much of a problem per se with that. We were fortunate enough to have the resources that we need. At some point, there was probably 10 trucks lined up at the transport location and 20 or more or I would say a lot more at the staging location just down the street, which was set up specifically just to stage those units.
So none of the victims had to be doubled up in a truck then, I imagine.
So the answer to that question is yes, they were. But again, it wasn't because of a logistical need. It was just that they happened to be there and ready to go at the time that the back doors of that truck swung open. So what they tried to do was put a priority patient in the truck with maybe one or two minor BLS patients that were not injured that bad. In a perfect world, everybody could have went in their own truck. In a perfect world, we would have had to put more than one person in. And in one situation, there was 2 critical patients in one truck. Again, that wasn't by design. We know that that's not the best practice. It just happened to be that at the time that truck was there with the people ready to load up that had a stretcher available at the time, those are the people that went in the back of that truck.
All of your trucks are ALS trucks, Chief? Is that right?
All of our trucks are ALS. All of our suppression fire apparatus are also ALS. Most of the suppression apparatuses in our county are all ALS certified, meaning they have paramedics on them. So we also used the staffing from suppression fire trucks to help staff once they arrived the treatment area, therefore allowing after the first few minutes for those rescue crews to get off the scene to get back in their truck and take patients, so we could staff the incident with paramedics from the engine companies.
Gotcha. The benefits of living in a densely populated area, I guess, is the availability of a lot of capable resources. So that's a great. So well, thanks, Chief. That was a really interesting rundown from your perspective. Perhaps we can switch over to Dr. Intevi. How did that day begin for you, and what were your initial thoughts? And let's also delve into the role that you played specifically at the scene.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. First, I want to really reemphasize how lucky we are to have leadership at this department, like Chief Mosier. Like he said, first on scene. We've, at least I personally have been through many MCI trainings where the initial folks coming into the scene, fumble a little bit. They don't get the messaging out correctly. They don't set up in the right location. There's no doubt in my mind that those decisions that Chief Mosier and really the entire leadership who showed up on scene essentially first that day, how much of an impact they made in the lives saved. And as someone who's now been in EMS for 11 years, I can tell you that Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department is was really set up mentally and from a training perspective, and just very fortunate that Chief Mosier showed up on scene first, because and again, I'll stop there, but I'll come back later to some of the times that happened here. But for me, I was at my office, which is about 8 or 9 miles away down the highway. And I heard the call come over the radio, and I essentially jumped in my car, and I found myself speeding down the highway at speeds I don't want to admit, with many police cars going. I was kind of in the line of police cars. I don't have any lights in my car, so thankfully they didn't stop me. And I ended up, if you look at the screen and you see Holmberg, if you could imagine about a mile to the left of that is the next major intersection. That's where I found myself turning into Holmberg and finding just a whole lot of cars just stopped. So I essentially had to park my car about a mile away, if you will, not knowing that, and again, this is all 2020 hindsight, that the shooter was on the loose. So here I am, and I had a collared shirt, long sleeve shirt, slacks, the whole thing. I found myself running about a mile down the road, and looking back at that, I'm not sure I made the best decision at that time to do that, but I ended up running all the way towards where Chief Mosier set up command, which is right where you see the words casualty collection, like you mentioned earlier. It's important to note that by the time I got there, all of the 17 people who made it out alive were already off the scene. And we'll go into the decisions that were made with respect to, setting up a triage, a treatment area, and how we handle that, or we just kind of changed what we normally would have done to the benefit of the patient, which I think turns out was probably one of the biggest silver linings and lessons learned here. And so by the time I had gotten there, we were now kind of just waiting for more patients to come out. And within a few minutes of my arrival, suddenly we had a golf cart kind of streaming out of the building towards us, with someone saying that they have a patient with a pulse. So I obviously met the golf cart, and we had the back doors of one of our ambulances open and ready to accept the patient. And now I found myself in the back of the ambulance with a patient and trying to make a decision now on what's exactly happening and should I go with the patient or stay on scene. And I vividly remember Chief Cardona, who was the medical branch that Chief Mosier had alluded to, who's really the person that I work with, very closely at the department on the medical side. He opened the door of our rescue and said, "Are you staying or are you leaving?" Meaning, you're the medical director, you're on scene. Are you leaving us or are you staying? Fortunately, one of my colleagues, also a medical director for another department who lived right down the street, showed up, and I kind of passed the baton over to him. And I made the decision to go with the patient. And we can discuss afterwards what ended up happening on that ride into the hospital. And then I ended up finding my way back. It turns out she was the last patient that was brought out of that building. And I had again many sleepless nights afterwards, wondering did I make the right decision or not. And that's kind of where we ended up that day. But I really have to say, and I think we're going to get into it in a little bit, that the decisions on how to triage those patients, to eliminate completely the use of tags and get those patients out, I think was probably the most critical decision, number one. And then the other thing I'll talk about is 4 days prior to this incident, we happened to have had on February 10th, which was a Saturday. Every year, what we do is we do a program with our commissioners, city leadership, where we bring them in. We show them how we cut cars open. But I also had set up a Stop the Bleed program where we taught essentially those city leaders how to stop the bleed. And prior to that, again, thanks to the leadership of this department, we had outfitted not just our EMS personnel and all of our apparatus, but we outfitted all of our police, our SWAT members with IFAKs, so that they had on their person all the tools necessary, including chest seals, tourniquets, etc., hemostatic gauze, to actually do what needed to be done, rather than wait for EMS to show up and do the work of placing tourniquets and chest seals. And I think that also, when I look back, was probably one of, if not the most important thing that was done that day, was the work done not by the EMS professionals, but the work done by the police department, law enforcement professionals who understood the need to not just carry those tools for their own right and for their colleagues if they got hit, but actually to be used on sick and injured patients, which is something that after we've traveled the country, we realized wasn't being done so much. So I'll stop there, but that was kind of the initial moments for me at the scene.
So, Doctor, when you showed up, did I hear you say that most of the critical or all of the criticals had already departed for the hospitals? Is that correct?
Every
Or
patient
except one, at
that
least
came,
one.
right, exactly. I should say, it turns out, and we can kind of circle back to it, that this patient really had been deemed dead, basically inside the building, and she was tagged as that. But it was very smoky in there, very difficult visibility. And one of the lessons learned is that they didn't see the black tape that was around her wrist. And someone checked for a pulse. They thought they felt it, and then they began to move her out of the building, when in fact that perhaps should not have been done. Playing Monday morning quarterback. But regardless of the fact, all of the patients, 100% of the patients who needed to be removed, who were viable, were removed prior to my arrival.
And
That's how
they
fast
were
everything
extracted. The 17 were extracted. The 17 survivors. What percentage were walking wounded, and then those that were not walking wounded, they were extracted by school staff and also tactical EMS. Is that right? There were some tactical medics on the scene,
Chief, you
or
wanna
was
handle
anyone else
that
involved
one?
in patient extraction? I'm just curious about how they were extracted.
Right, I see Chief is muted. Kevin, you might have, there he goes. Go ahead, Chief.
Kevin, it's safe to say that all of the patients were removed by school staff, law enforcement personnel, and SWAT medics, who are fire department employees that work on our apparatus, engines, and rescues, that are cross-trained in tactical law enforcement. None of the fire department frontline response vehicles entered the school by design. And obviously, I don't want to jump around too much and screw up your timeline or anything, but just a little bit of insight into the incident. There were several times during this incident, early on and long after the incident, all the patients were out of the school, that the location of the shooter was not known. So,
right, so still a hot zone for all.
Absolutely. So, sending non-SWAT medics,
right,
or fire department personnel into that school, even in the school boundaries, was not appropriate at the time.
right.
One of the things too that I think is important to mention, and maybe at this time is hopefully it's a good one, but we had trained in active assailant, active shooter training the year prior to this event. Obviously never knowing that this was going to happen in our jurisdiction, but our fire department, EMS, and police department trained for this, heavy duty trained, simunitions, shotgun rounds in our schools, and training with our personnel to be as realistic as possible. One of the things that some of your participants might have heard about is refusing to send fire rescue personnel into the school. We had established rescue task forces outside of the school. I assigned one of our chief officers as an operations officer specifically to handle that part of the response fairly early on in the incident. And he did coordinate with law enforcement, and there was not a time that rescue task force was able to work in the school for exactly the reasons that it was intended not to work. We know that those RTFs are able to operate in the warm zone, and because the shooter's location was not known, I guess in layman's term, there was never a warm zone to be had.
But suffice it to say, if the scene was declared a warm zone, then your jurisdiction is one that utilizes the rescue task force concept. Is that right?
Absolutely. And we had actually trained that rescue task force concept with our law enforcement partners, not just with the Coral Springs Police Department, but the Broward Sheriff's Office, whose jurisdiction it was the day of that event. Just a little background, we didn't really talk about it at the beginning, but the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Department, the city of Parkland is, for lack of a better terms, a contract city for us. We provide fire and EMS services to the city of Parkland. The city of Coral Springs Police Department only handles Coral Springs. The the Broward Sheriff's Office is contracted to provide law enforcement services to Parkland. So we were working with a agency that wasn't of our own city. However, we had trained with the Broward Sheriff's Office deputies on several occasions. So that is something that obviously benefited us that day. And again, we talked about the incident wasn't perfect and there was a lot of lessons learned, but really the training and the integration between us and those agencies worked out very well that day. Dr. Antevi mentioned the hemostatic agents and chest seals and things of that nature that are carried by our police officers. Doc, maybe jump in here, but you know, there were patients that came out of that school that had multiple dressings of that nature on, and I truly believe that was the difference between life and death for some of them.
There's no doubt, and I think for me, looking back, and you know, we've given presentations now to multiple law enforcement entities, really asking and begging them to understand the necessity for PD to actively engage with, and I know it's difficult to do, right? I mean, I've never been in that field, and I know that when you're in a hot zone and you're being asked to treat victims, it's not an easy thing to do. However, the field of EMS, as many of you know, has transformed quite dramatically in the last several years, where you now have fire and EMS who have bulletproof vests, and we have, you know, the gear, if you will, and you have PD who may be moving patients into the warm zone. And so if you come and look at our MCI training today, you may have a hard time, except for the firearms, you may have a hard time distinguishing who's police and who's fire. And I think that change, I think, needs to be kind of moved throughout the country, because of the fact that PD gets there first. They know what they're doing. They're very capable of doing many things, including CPR, etc., Narcan, you name it. And so, I mean, I kind of naively didn't realize how lucky we were at this particular agency in Broward County, which I think was a few years ahead of really the other agencies in the county, unbeknownst to me. I just thought that everyone did that, but I've learned since then that doesn't happen everywhere.
Indeed, the rescue task force concept is something I'm a big believer in, and thankfully it seems to be spreading across the country. I think few people would argue against the concept of an integrated response, and I think that warm zone treatment can make all the difference in some cases.
Yeah.
In many cases.
I'm a huge RTF fan, and we train on this topic, and I just love seeing it in action. And I have to say that not knowing all the details of what was happening on the scene, remember, I came late, right? I wasn't there early on. And when I came there and I saw our RTF ready to go, but not being deployed in there, again, it's because I'm not the incident commander, and nor should I be, but the decisions were made correctly. However, if those 17 were not extracted like they were, right? And some people may look at that and say, well, why did those people extract those patients like they did? They weren't supposed to do that. If we would have waited for the RTF, we would have had 34 casualties, period. So I think that, yes, an RTF is hugely important, but I think to look at the step prior to the RTF is really where maybe some of the lives could be saved in future incidents if people are thinking in that, with that mentality.
Right. And improvisation is definitely necessary in some of these instances.
Oh.
In terms of the BLS adjuncts, the tourniquets, the chest seals, do we know how many were used? I'm just curious at the scene. They came in handy. They saved lives. Were they widely used?
Yes, I have the number. I may be flipping these around, but 4 chest seals, 7 tourniquets is what. It's been a while since we gave the presentation, but there was a 7 and a 4 in there. So I believe it was 4 chest seals and 7 tourniquets, all placed by non-EMS professionals on the scene.
Wow, fascinating. A question about triage. I'm curious, does your department have its own triage program, triage training, or does your organization subscribe to one of the better known ones such as Star Triage, for example?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and I'll tell you that we've been training with START. We have the triage tags. Again, it's not something that we use every day, therefore we're not accustomed to it. And the decision made by Chief Cardona at the time, which is really another kind of moment-to-moment decision, which turned out to be life-saving, was to just skip all of that. And he was able to look at the patient, understand the severity of the illness just with a quick kind of visual, if you will.
Right.
And then he assigned one, and like you heard Chief Moser said, more than one, with multiple personnel to each vehicle. And when the story was told and all was said and done, and we look back at the outcomes, it was really minutes and seconds that we were talking about here with respect to life and death. And if some of you saw the 60 Minutes piece that just aired again, and they had an update with one of the patients, Maddie Wilford, she's a classic example of she was about to die in the back of that ambulance were it not for an amazing Lieutenant Lazo Heda and the crew he was with to make some very important decisions. And she's just one example of many of the examples that at least proved to me today that putting them on a tarp in the red section would have been a huge mistake.
Right, right. I think if
I'm sorry.
The
only thing I'll say is, just because I don't want to forget it, is that we have looked at the ramp, right, rather than STAR. I'm not sure if you're familiar with ramp, but I think there's to expect an EMS professional to know to start doing mathematics, calculating vital signs, to start to pick where that person goes in this algorithm, in the, like you called it, Kevin, the fog of war. Impossible. Cannot be done, in my opinion. And because we're in system one thinking, which is just that innate knowledge of what to do next, rather than system two, where you have to think, okay, what's the respiratory rate?
Right.
That I think has to be rethought on these events that are transpiring very quickly, as opposed to something where you're on maybe a bus accident where you have all these people and you have time to evaluate what's going on.
Well, I think too, Doc, if you don't mind me jumping in there, I think it very easily can be explained like this. You have 10 patients that all come out at once, and there's one ambulance there waiting for that person. That's where triage is very important. You're not putting 10 in the back of one truck. But when one patient comes out and there's 5 trucks sitting there, or 2 patients that come out and there's 2 or 3 trucks sitting there at that very time, the decision was made not to do exactly what Dr. Intevi spoke about, which is to take time and do a triage session when the resources were available there to just put them in a truck and go. And again, to other people's credit, those decisions were made, and I think they were the right ones, obviously. And we got some heat for them, though. Why didn't you put tags on people? Why didn't you do this? So, but again, the ones that were there making the decisions at the time had to make very difficult decisions. And again, I believe they were done well. On a side note too, Dr. Boyer just texted me, said he's logging in here. So that's kind of good timing as to being able to get these folks to the hospital and what he encountered there. So hopefully he'll be popping up on your screen any minute now.
Excellent. We'll make sure to let him in the room. And I will just say one thing about the triage algorithms, very difficult skill to master. I think that the algorithms are probably applicable in a classroom setting where you can introduce the topic of triage to people who are not otherwise educated on it. But to apply the algorithms on scene, for me personally, I know that would be extremely challenging. And so I guess you just have to get to the point where you take a glance, it's a gut feel, and they're either red or yellow. And I think if you think it's probably a mistake to let a whole lot of victims start piling up on a red tarp, because that's not where they need to be. They need to be en route to a hospital and an operating room. And in other active shooter incidences, I know they used, police cars to get them to the hospital and to not let them pile up on a red tarp. And in that case, it really saved a lot of lives. So I think improvisation is a big part of it. And I think that the triage algorithms, great place to start in an educational setting, but in the field, you need to go deeper than that, and you need to be faster. So.
And Kevin, I'll add into that. If you look at some historical data, at the Virginia Tech shooting, there was a 69% over triage rate. At the Fort Hood massacre, 70% were inappropriately triaged. And that inappropriate triage then, in effect, the domino effect of that is that it leads to the misuse of resources, and then ultimately could potentially increase the fatality rate. So I think it is time here in 2021 to really start to reevaluate triage in these types of situations that are, I think specific perhaps to the active shooter.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So I'd like to introduce to everyone Dr. Evan Boyer. Dr. Boyer, can you hear us, sir?
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I know all three of you have a very busy schedule, so we are all very appreciative of your time. Dr. Boyer is an emergency department physician who treated many of the victims at Broward Health North Hospital. Is that correct, sir?
Correct.
And that hospital was located just, I think it was 11 miles from the scene. So, Doctor, what we've done here so far, you're actually joining it at a very good time. We just basically did an introduction of the chief and Dr. Intevi, and now we've introduced you. And if you could, you just take about a minute or so and just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, so our attendees can get to know you from a personal level.
Sure, and really thanks for having me, and sorry I'm late. So Evan Boyer is my name. At the time of the MSD incident, I was chairman of the emergency department at Broward Health North. Since then, I've become the chief medical officer for emergency medicine for our Broward Health system. We have 4 hospitals: Coral Springs, Broward Health North, Broward Health Medical Center, and Broward Health Imperial Point. Trauma centers, North and Medical Center. I'm also currently the vice chief of staff at Broward Health North and work all my clinical shifts there. And that's who I am.
Okay. So the 3 hospitals that were in play that day, Broward Health North and Broward Health Medical Center, they're both level 2 trauma centers. Is that correct?
So Broward North is level 2, and Broward Health Medical Center is level 1.
Level 1. Okay. And so the level 2 was about 11 miles away. The level 1 was about 23 miles away, if I had my math correct. So maybe some interesting decision-making going on there, perhaps. I'm not sure. But, and then the 3rd hospital was Broward Health Coral Springs, which I believe 1 or 2 victims went to who had minor injuries. Is that correct, Chief?
Yeah, Broward Health Coral Springs is a facility that's in our city that we take a lot of patients to. We did take a couple minor patients there, and even a little bit after the main portion of the incident was over is when we took those patients there. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Dr. Boyer, I just want to say you're not late at all. Actually, your timing was exquisite. It's perfect timing. So if you could just tell us, how did that day begin for you? What were your initial thoughts when you realized this was not going to be a normal day for you? And just tell us a little bit about your role and the role of your organization.
Sure. So fortunately, it was an event that took place around 2:30 in the afternoon. And the reason why I say that is you asked what kind of day it was. So it's your normal day in the ED. And around that time is when you have most of your staff. You're pretty much at your maximum staff at that time. And likewise, your hospital is maximally staffed. You have most of your ORs going. You have most of your consultants in-house doing procedures, pre-oping for procedures. So you have a lot of staff on hand in-house. And for us, it was a typical afternoon, and then we get pre-hospital intelligence that there is a potential MCI. So what that prompts to do is stay in communication with our pre-hospital personnel. And then once we know that it's a viable threat, we discuss that with our ED leadership and our administrative leadership. We have an administration on call. And then collectively, we can implement a what we call a code green. And that's what we did. That's something that is a policy and procedures that are in place. And then it kind of just lays out what your hospital response is. And, fortunately, probably about 8 months prior to this episode, we actually had a code drill with a relatively similar entity. It was a mock drill where there was high school students touring a local school, and there was a active shooter there. And we had about 40 high school students who dressed up like they were, victims, and then transported to our hospital. And we had a code green drill, which was, as fate would have it, then, 8 months later, you have the real deal. And with all these disasters, if you will, you learn the most in your post hoc analysis. So every drill we do, nothing's perfect, but then we could fine tune things. And then when we actually have a true incident, we feel that as an institution, it puts us in the best position to be able to handle it. So, that was kind of the initial, I guess, feeling at the ED. You can add in the fact that you get this pre-hospital intelligence that it's at a high school in a community that the majority of us live in. So that adds another layer to it, if you will, which you kind of have to check that at the door and then just go about your business.
Mm-hmm. So for all three of you gentlemen, how good was the intelligence that day? How were the hospital notifications made? And I guess a third part of that question would be, how did you pick hospital assignment for the different victims? So that's kind of a loaded question. We'll start with the first one. How good was the intel, the communications?
So I can tell you what not only our process is day to day, but what happened on that day. We have a MedCom, medical communications radio system, like I'm sure most agencies have. Ours is monitored by the county dispatch system. And anytime a certain level of MCI is declared, it's the county MedCom's responsibility to not only notify all the hospitals of that level of MCI, but they also do a hospital capability worksheet for us, regardless of whether they dispatch for us or not, telling us, they poll all the hospitals and they determine what each hospital can take, how many greens, how many yellows, and how many reds that they can take at each facility. I can tell you that Broward Health North, for example, at one point in the incident was asked how many of each that they could take, and like Dr. Boyer said, they had enough staff there. They said, bring us everything you got, and that hospital was phenomenal about taking patients. But we do have a process in place, and that is handled on every MCI that we have. So from the hospital's angle, the MedCom will call the hospital on the phone or on their radio and say, Coral Springs has a level 2 MCI, and tell us what you can do. And then internally, they'll make notifications. The docs will have to speak to how that happens, but I understand they make notifications at the hospital level to let them know what's coming in.
Got it. And so Dr. Boyer, Broward Health North said you can send us all you got. What was the distribution between Broward Health North and Broward Health Medical Center in terms of patient? Was it about 50-50 in terms of victim distribution?
Yeah, I think it was about 60-40-ish, if I remember correctly. 60% North, 40% Medical Center.
And so your organization volunteered to take as many patients as necessary. Was that you had good bed availability at that time, or you had a surplus of staff on duty? Obviously your posture was very good to start receiving a lot of patients. So how big is your emergency department? How many beds?
We have 50 beds.
And on that day, do you remember what the census was on that day? You obviously had some bed availability, so.
Yeah, so, we have plenty of hallways, and what we typically do in these type of situations is we can make the beds available. And what we need to have is what we consider is our core team. So what do I mean by that? Our core team for us is a surgeon, an ER doctor, a nurse, a respiratory therapist, and a paramedic. So we call them like a team of 5. So if we could set up 6 teams of 5, and we have 6 rooms in a row in our critical care area, we have 3 trauma bays and have about 11 critical care rooms. So we know that we could rotate those 6 teams to any patient coming in. And then if we lose the team upstairs to the OR, had other surgeons on hand where the traumatologists would do the initial procedure to stabilize, then they leave, and they would leave it to a general surgeon to close or clean up and then come back downstairs. So the key was, like Chief, the key was that communication. So yes, we set up our incident command center. We had MedCom communication going back and forth, but an additional layer to that, we had direct communication. It was myself with one of the Coral Springs Parkland Fire Rescue leadership, direct communication of, we anticipate 3 more in the next 5 minutes, 6 more in 10 minutes. So then we were able to stay a couple of steps at a game where we could let the teams out there know what we can handle. And at that time, we felt confident we'd be able to whatever they could bring us.
Kevin, I'm gonna make a few comments here. I work for another hospital system further south in the county. I have to say that, I like I said earlier, came in with one of the patients into Dr. Boyer's emergency department. And, I can tell you, I'll never forget those moments as long as I live. It was so well run and it was so smooth. And just like he said, there were teams, the rooms were clean, they were empty, they were ready to accept more patients. I brought in the last patient that day, but he could have accepted many more. The organization and listen, we all do MCI drills at the hospital, and you end up seeing, tons of people walking through the hallways, kind of looking aimlessly, where am I supposed to be? Boy, these guys did a fantastic job. And again, many of those people, including the one that I mentioned earlier, were on the brink of death, and they just did an incredible job. So that interplay between EMS and the hospital and Dr. Boyer's team was just, it was flawless. So just lots of credit goes to him and his team.
Certainly, and the proof is in the numbers, and numbers don't lie. Every single patient that could be saved that day was saved, and that's a remarkable outcome.
And we talked about Dr. Boyer just mentioned that there was a representative from our agency at the hospital. We had supervisors from surrounding jurisdictions showing up to the command post saying, "How can I help?" And it's very easy to turn somebody away if you have nothing for them, but this was a good opportunity for exactly what Dr. Boyer just said. We had representatives, chief officers, either from our department or from surrounding departments that we were comfortable with, going to all of the hospitals, all over the receiving facilities, and acting as a liaison. They had our radios, they had our channels, they were speaking directly with the medical group on the radio so that they could tell the hospital directly what was coming in and how many were in the hopper and what that staging location looked like and how many people were coming. So to Dr. Boyer's credit, like he just said, there was a good line of communication there, and I think that helped out a lot. There was no surprises with 5 people showing up at the ER door waiting for care. They knew people were coming in.
And I think some other lessons learned, just like Chief Mosier and Dr. Boyer has said, is that if in the event that you do have a situation like this, everybody immediately wants to come to the scene, right? You have everyone who's listening on the TV, the radio, what have you. And I think that, it's really smart to say, okay, you're an EMS medical director who's not on scene, head to the hospital, be our eyes and ears at the hospital level. We've already spoken about sending units, rescue units, to the hospitals, because if in the event that those hospitals were overloaded and perhaps some of the more mild patients could be transported to another hospital, that's another idea that needs to be utilized. We were fortunate that didn't have to happen, but I think that just thinking outside the box and establishing those great resources at those other locations is really a fantastic idea moving forward.
Yes, indeed.
And Kevin, to piggyback on Dr. Antebi's point there, if you had a scenario where some of our team, so we had a team of 5, if you will, if you start to exploit that to the point where you're running out of your resources, if EM units are at the hospital with us, we could implement an EMS personnel to be of our teams. They're well able to handle airways, so they could step in and be our airway.
Right.
They're well able to step in and be a member of that. So you utilize that. In addition, if there becomes traffic issues, this was actually brought up by one of the docs who was involved in the Las Vegas MCI. It was a really neat thought, where that if you have a particular surgeon that they physically can't drive to the hospital because of the amount of traffic, sometimes you might be able to utilize a light sirens team to actually get them and bring them into the hospital. So having them there is something that is a really good idea.
Indeed. Got to improvise, adapt, and overcome whenever you run into these problems, for sure. So, Dr. Boyer, I'm curious, we can all sort of imagine the types of injuries in this case, many of them very serious, so we don't need to delve too deeply into the type of injuries. But when they come to your emergency room, I'm curious how many were immediately life-threatening, and how long would things happen pretty fast, especially since you had such a well-oiled machine. A seriously injured victim who needs to go to the operating room, how long do they spend in your ER, emergency department, before they're sent into the operating room? Is it several minutes? Is it longer than that? I'm just curious the process. How long does it take to get someone into the operating room?
Mm-hmm. So it would depend on the injury, or more importantly, the mechanism of the injury that we're suspicious of. And then literally as long as it takes to probably put in a chest tube, maybe 2, plus or minus open the chest, and then they're upstairs if that's where they need to go. So maybe they'd be up in 15 minutes from the time that they hit the ER door, bilateral chest tubes, plus or minus a chest, and then upstairs. That would be about the time frame. And that would be pretty standard for us if we get a gunshot wound on a Friday night, of how we would expedite them upstairs.
And that timeline holds true even with the number of victims that you had. So they're in the emergency room perhaps 15 minutes or so. And how many operating rooms were activated and used in the first hour or two?
Probably about 6 would be my guess, somewhere around there,
okay.
Which is something that you can handle, right? So then
Right.
you could get patients up that fast. If you have 30 that need to go to the OR, well, they're going to be in the ED a little bit longer.
Right.
But it's really based on the volume and number. And an interesting thing that we found helpful in an ad hoc analysis was to actually engage surgical techs in ED flow and MCIs. What do I mean by that? A surgical tech is quite savvy at bringing instruments to the surgeon when if there is a holdup in them going to the OR. So we have added surgical techs to our flow and MCIs in our traumas.
Kevin, I want to make a quick comment because the patient that I ended up bringing in with me, again, was a patient who had two bullet wounds, and they didn't really look like much on the outside. I was told by the person bringing her out that she had a pulse. So of course, we started making our way to Dr. Boyer's facility. And boy, it seemed like a long time. That run that looks so short on your map felt like an eternity. And you know, we at that moment, yeah. So it's actually the other hospital that we went to. We went to North. So en route, what had happened is that you know, I knew from, you know, because I'm an ED physician, that what would I do if I was in the ED right now? We didn't at the time have in our protocols the ability to do a finger thoracostomy, but we did have a scalpel. So I performed in the back of the rescue, you know, bilateral finger thoracostomies, and got just, you know, it was a big hemopneumo on the left. The reason I'm saying this story is because to answer the question you gave, you posed to Dr. Boyer, which is, I remember coming into the room and transferring care to his team. And then I immediately walked out of the room and I went to the corner and I lost it, okay? And I couldn't have been out of that area for, you know, I think it was less than 15 minutes. When I walked back around, I gathered myself and I walked back to leave, and that room was empty.
Wow.
And I said to myself, there's no way in the world that she's not there anymore. She was out of that room. They had you know, opened the chest. And so indeed, they really performed that fast in the middle of a, you know, the worst MCI we've ever seen. So again, just to their credit, they just deserve a lot of credit there. And then the other thing I will mention is that at the time, we did not have whole blood available to us on the scene. Thanks to the Broward Sheriff's Office, people like Dr. Jim Roach, who's their medical director, and Chief Heath Clark, we now have whole blood. It's not still universal everywhere, but we can bring the helicopter anywhere and provide the whole blood. But that's the one gap that we noticed that we had that day, is we didn't have blood on the scene. And now in Broward County, we do have whole blood, and we're working on now expanding it, scaling it throughout the county so that we can provide really the life-saving treatment if a patient really is teetering on the edge.
Right, right. It's really blood that is the sine qua non of patient survival and these kinds of things, I would imagine. Of course, I'm not a doctor or a nurse, but what little clinical experience I have as an EMT, I know that really it comes down to blood and perfusion, and that's it. And so let's hope that that concept of deploying blood products into the field, blood and blood products into the field, just like Rescue Task Force, let's hope that keeps expanding throughout the country. So
yeah, maybe it's worth clarifying one thing. This shooter was very very deliberate about where those bullets went. So I will say, you know, just in case, just to clarify, this is a very important clarification, that the 17 who unfortunately we lost that day, even if we would have had blood on the scene, there's nothing that could have been done because of where those bullets went.
right.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Some wounds are just not going to be survivable, unfortunately.
Correct.
So in our remaining time, we have just two more questions I want to hit upon, and really we've kind of hit upon that already, but maybe we can expand just a little bit. It has to do with just preparedness, organizational preparedness, and personal preparedness. I'd like to quickly go through that and then just hopefully have time for a little bit of question and answer. So I'd like to quickly ask about organizational preparedness. And again, we already touched on some of this, but you know, we're talking about disaster planning and MCI planning and exercising and equipping facilities. And, you know, we can all agree that regardless of the discipline we come from or the credentials we have or the designation a hospital might have, it's very challenging to adequately train for an event like this. There's no way on earth to replicate the intensity of that scene in a classroom, and there's no way to introduce perfect authenticity into an exercise environment. But we all know that planning, training, exercising, it's totally indispensable to those of us in the emergency response profession. So that said, your organizations were all successful that day, and that would strongly suggest a commitment to excellence and preparation and your professionalism. But what else can we talk about? How else? what can you offer in terms of advice to an organization to prepare for a day like that? Are there any other practices or procedures that organizations might want to consider so they can be prepared for the unthinkable? And Chief, why don't we roll back to you and start at the beginning?
Sure. Train as if your life depends on it is one of those things that we say in the fire department often. And, you know, train until you can't get it wrong. And really in our situation here, we were fortunate, for whatever reason you want to say that was, that we had heavy duty trained on this exact subject prior to. And we take a lot of our incidents seriously. I'll give you a quick scenario about how, you know, I've been asked about, you know, we have our radio tapes available for people to listen to. And, you know, somebody asked me why the incident command structure works so well and how we were so calm and those sorts of things. Every multi-company response that we respond to in our city, where we send more than one truck to, we establish incident command protocols. If it's a run-of-the-mill alarm at the apartment complex down the street, the first unit that goes on scene becomes command, and they divvy out assignments. It becomes second nature to us, so that when an incident of this magnitude hits, the incident command structure is not foreign to us. It's something that we're so used to doing. And you know, myself in my career over the years being involved in, you know, we have a couple post office in town that have a very senior population close to, I can't tell you how many times cars have driven through the front of the post office, and that quickly becomes an MCI. You know, you become proficient at those. And when you're done with those calls, you go back to the station or back to your home base and you talk about how that incident went and how you could have done it better. And honestly, that is the best way to prepare yourself, is to get used to doing it and train and be able to admit when you did something wrong. You know, again, just like Dr. Antevi had mentioned, and I'm sure Dr. Boyer has as well, we've talked about this subject a ton of times with people because we want to make sure that they have lessons learned from it. We're not afraid to say the command post was a little bit too close to the school. You know, we're not afraid to say that maybe we should have had these certain people, emergency management, called out sooner than we did. We're not afraid to say those things because this, unfortunately, is going to happen again somewhere. We hope for your sake it doesn't happen in your jurisdiction, but if it does, we want you to remember the things that we forgot so that you don't forget them too. So just be proficient, train, pretend that your scenarios that you're doing with your departments and training now, pretend that they're the real thing, because one day they may become the real thing.
Yeah, it's axiomatic in the military to train like you fight and fight like you train, right? So when the real event happens, it's all muscle memory. It sounds like that's what you're sort of alluding to. Do it the same every time, up until the point in which you have to improvise, but only if necessary. So I like what you have to say there. Dr. Antevi, did we lose you?
Hey, it looks like he dropped off. I'll send him a text and see if he's coming back. Maybe he tripped over a wire or something.
All right. Well, we're going to shift the spotlight then, Dr. Boyer. We're going to shift it to you. And if you could just give us a couple of pearls of wisdom for how an organization can best prepare, a hospital can best prepare to meet its noble obligation.
Yeah. So I think it's important, and we do this for each of our sites. We on a yearly basis, we look at viable threats, and then we rank those viable threats, and we score those viable threats for likelihood of taking place. And based on that scorecard, we then try to gear and curtail our drills that we do. You can't predict what the next etiology of MCI is going to be, but you could try to percentage-wise figure out what is highly likely. You know, down in Southeast Florida, you could say, well, we're always ready for hurricanes, and we've done it a million times. Right. But what about, you know, cyber threats or mass shootings or what have you? So we, as an organization, we go through and we say, okay, what threats are an option to us? And then let's drill for those. And like Chief said, you have to drill and drill, and then you have to be able to be open-minded and learn from those. But I like what Chief alluded to in the sense that you don't have to have a large scale MCI to fine tune your system. If there is a smaller event or episode and you're implementing your command center and assigning roles, that's really good training and practice for them when something comes on a grand scale. Everybody's a little bit more prepared for that. So even if there's a bomb threat in the hospital, you know, you implement your command center, people report, and
Right.
then, you know, you figure out everybody's roles and responsibilities. And an additional layer for our medical staff is there's a joint commission requirement that the medical staff receives education for disaster management. And we present that at our medical staff annual meeting of what their roles and responsibilities are, who they work to, what it means with our Broward Health notification system. If they do get notified, how do they respond, and things of that nature. So you just, you know, have to just keep doing that and keep learning from what you do. And then the next episode, you might be a little bit better.
Right, exactly. I'm glad that you mentioned the hospital command center piece and the incident management training piece, because I think those are so essential. And your discussion about doing a hazard vulnerability analysis is very important too, of course, to rank what the priorities are. And I think one of the takeaways there is you have to, you know, risk is not just about the probability of something happening. It's about the consequence too. So something might be low probability like active shooter, but the consequences are so high that you have to pay attention to both in your ranking of hazards. And I'm sure that's the process you went through. So
and Kevin, I could tell you something interesting from what we learned is, so you have your standard, you know, command center, incident command leaders, our algorithm based on our CROGRE policy. And then you had asked earlier about, did we have beds, we have rooms available. So we have an additional layer where we assign a, you know, well, boarding patients get moved there straight away. And if you could be discharged, you get discharged. But we assign one of our ED doctors to be the ED patient MD. So in other words, they're just running around the rooms to all the existing patients, making sure there's no change in their clinical status.
right.
And then we have 2 triage ED MDs where because you still have people walking up to your hospital. So we have triage ED MDs taking care of patients out front. And then we have a CED-MD. So we have an ED doctor that goes around and see who could be discharged that minute. So we kind of added a layer like that. And, you know, there's multiple examples that allude to of things that we've kind of learned along the way and that we'll kind of do next time.
Very good. Very good. And Dr. Intevi, I see you're back with us.
Yeah, I'm up here in the mountains, hills, whatever you call them, of Connecticut. So I apologize. I had to move to a different.
That's quite all right. And I promise you, we're getting near the end here. We're just finishing our discussion on how organizations can best plan for something like this. So do you have a pearl of wisdom you can share with us in terms of organizational preparedness? We've touched upon some things already, but perhaps you can leave us with one more idea or concept.
Sure. I think that one of the big things that have come out for me, and this is also for me personally, is the mental health issues that accompany events like these. We're very fortunate that the fire chief, who's now our city manager, Frank Babinick, you know, he had a vision years ago, knowing, you know, we've had some other incidents in our department that have caused, you know, pretty big emotional toll. And he started this years ago, where he brought in what we call clinicians, basically psychologists and therapists who have their own private practice. He brought them in one weekend and he said, we're going to teach you what the fire department does. We cut open cars, he put on the bunker gear, the whole thing. And out of the 15 that came that day, 5 raised their hand afterwards and said, I want to volunteer to work with Coral Springs. And so we had them in play for, I would say, for a couple of years. I, as a medical director, just thought that they were part of our department and they were being paid. And so it turns out that from the moment the event happened, on the scene that day, we already had our clinicians out there. And then we ended up having, we started with 30 days and then 60 days and ended up being open for months, where we had the availability for people to come in, like myself, and speak to someone personally, which I've never have done in my life, to be quite honest.
Right.
So I think that as you're looking at these things, understanding that the incident may have taken, I think that the last shot fired was at 4 minutes and 35 seconds. So those 4 minutes and 35 seconds led to years of emotional trauma for many of us.
Right.
And so if you only focus on the first couple of minutes, you end up losing out on what needs to be done for years to come. So that's the one pearl that I'll leave with you guys.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Disaster mental health is such a big component of resilience for both responders and for the communities. So, and it's ongoing. Like you said, most people never really fully get over it. And so you have to manage that piece very carefully. I'm very glad you mentioned that. It's a big part of resilience. So,
Yes.
Okay, very quickly, maybe just a minute or two. I'm going to ask each one of you to just share with us something from a personal preparedness perspective. So we'll depart from organizational preparedness, and I just want to hear something from you about, crisis management from a personal perspective. You're all in the business of dealing with difficult and unnerving challenges, and you've spent years doing what you do. But for a day like this, it's different, and regardless of training and experiences that you've all had in your careers, you were each called upon that day individually to go above and beyond. And given the amplified emotions of dealing with children in this case, perhaps you had to dig even deeper than you've ever had to dig before. So just in short, what can somebody do to prepare, to be able to focus, to be able to compartmentalize and maintain composure so we can all do what you gentlemen did on that day? How do we do it? How do we find the courage and the fortitude to perform? Chief?
Yeah, I can start. I really think, and you said some of them, just, the mental preparation, but, being able to just understand that this event could happen in your community and you're going to have to respond to it. I'm fortunate enough that I have a significant other that's in the business, but that doesn't mean that she was there that day as well. So, you have to be able to have a good family outlet and be able to prepare yourself ahead of time. I mean, we talk about like what we did afterwards, but you really have to have a good support structure or have the ability to know where you can go after the fact if you need the help. I mean, Dr. Atevi talked about some of the programs we did here. I mean, we had the families of those people that were on the call come in after the event and do like events with families so that everybody could participate in things together. So, I don't think there's no way to prepare yourself for this type of call. I don't care how many videos you watch. I don't care how many seminars you've been to. There is nothing as real as seeing a dead child wheeled across from you, or for Dr. Atevi to be putting his fingers in the holes of a kid. There's nothing that's going to prepare you for that, but you have to be able to know yourself and know what your limits are and be able to ask for help if you need it.
Very good. Appreciate that, sir. Dr. Atevi, how about you? How does somebody prepare for this mentally?
My story is like a tale of two cities, because I've been an emergency department physician for over 20 years. And I would come home and I don't tell anyone anything. I don't come home and tell my wife about the patients I treated, and I kind of internalized a lot of things. And that's in part because of just that's kind of a part of the job and what we were trained to do. But then on the EMS side, when I became an EMS medical director, I kind of was welcomed into this family of people who are very caring and very skilled. And I was able for the first time to understand the importance of opening up, talking to people who know what you're dealing with, and not let's say a family member. And so I think that The fire service has been very good to me and for me as a person. And if you're at a department like I'm fortunate to be at, which I think is really, the best department in the world, really, from the top down, and just the amount of support that's given before, the amount of training that was done prior to this, and then all the actions of those people on the day of and afterwards, it really kind of made me more mature as a person to understand what really is required when you go through these types of events, no matter how strong that you think that you are in your career. So I think it's just been very beneficial. And if you are with the fire department, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because it's really a family feeling that's been just greatly beneficial to my career.
Very good. Very good. Thank you for sharing that, sir. And Dr. Boyer, what's your secret recipe for success in stressful situations?
Well, Kevin, you like to think that you prepare yourself your whole life for your next shift. And I think you have to have the mindset that you've put yourself and your organization has put itself in the best position based on whatever type of drills you have done, whatever type of personnel you've hired, whatever colleagues worked with you, whatever staff that you call your family when you work in a normal shift, that you've put yourself in the best position to take care of any patient or any situation that comes in. And I think that you have to be fully confident at that moment that you're the guy. This is what you do. So you do your job, and you do your job to the best of your ability. And unfortunately, there will be some poor outcomes that are potentially unavoidable, but then along the way that you'll save many lives. And if you prepare and perform the best of your ability, then for us, we'd be able to sleep at night. And that's my approach. And it's very interesting because we found that to be a bit easier for some providers who, let's say, were on a few of our teams that got more of our critically ill patients versus another provider that you assign to do ED triage, right? So they, in their mind, might say, well, I want to be back there, right? I want to be in the recess room. However, they're just as important as everybody else. And I think the goal, the success for an MCI, and Dr. Antevi alluded to the organization, if you will, when it came into our facility, is that everybody has to stay in their lane. Here's your job, do it to the best of your ability, and collectively, we will succeed to the best that we can. And if everybody does that, that could keep your head straight. So that's what we try to do, and especially golden hour. After that, when the dust settles, then obviously collectively, we came together as a department, and there was some, heavy briefing and some heavy moments for sure, and everybody needed that to get that off their chest. So that's my story.
Sounds like what you're all alluding to is really a very personal commitment to excellence, and you really have to be a true believer vis-a-vis preparedness if we're going to play these roles, the important roles that we have to play here. So I really appreciate you all sharing that, sharing your thoughts with us. It's very important. A lot of good takeaways there. So, excuse me, to keep things rolling along, we can, unless you have anything to add, we can roll into just a quick question and answer period and see if anyone has any questions they'd like to pose to the panel. Oh, we have one here. We have a question to hospital medical staff. It looks like they want to know about blood was an issue. To the hospital medical staff, I know you stated blood was an issue. Can you expand upon that? Was blood an issue, access to blood during the treatment? And the second part of that question is, were there any other medical supplies that you could have used or that you
I can start, and I'll just kind of allude to what I mentioned before, which is that in EMS at the time on February 14th of that year, we did not have access to whole blood in the field. And that has since changed. But the hospital surely has that ability. The only thing I will mention is, and again, this is something that's new in EMS. We're not going to carry component therapy. It's just not logistically reasonable for us to do, and whole blood is just easier and obviously faster to give. We have a warming device. We have a device that allows us to give literally a unit within about a minute and a half. And what we're working through now in our county is working with the trauma center so that they themselves can carry whole blood. And the reason for that, if you want to have a whole blood program in your EMS system, you need to have a way to swap out the unused units with the trauma center who's using the blood. If the trauma center is not using whole blood, they're only using component therapy, then the units that are being used in EMS, the whole blood units that go unused, have to be thrown away, and it's tremendously wasteful. So we are working towards that goal, so that we can be very wise and judicious with our whole blood use in the field. And then I'll let Evan talk about the blood at the hospital level.
Yeah, we did not have any issues with blood at the hospital level. And then I saw there was another question about, was there any medical supplies you could have used further? And we had adequate supplies. However, a follow-up to that is something that we found helpful with our supplies is that we had set up OR rooms for certain pathologies. So in other words, we had OR room for ortho, for chest abdomen pathology, neurosurgery pathology. So then if somebody comes in and they have intracranial pathology from a GSW, they go to the OR room that's kind of pre-set up for the neurosurgeon versus just going into the OR and bringing that in there. So it was more utilization of supplies to be accessed faster rather than shortcomings of supplies. We didn't have any shortcomings.
Okay, and that's all very insightful, very interesting. Chief Mosier, from a supply standpoint, I'd like to just very quickly run that question to you as well. So your trucks were adequately supplied, and what would you recommend other EMS agencies do to make sure that their trucks are adequately supplied? Do you ever get the sense that maybe as a whole, that maybe a lot of EMS trucks maybe need more equipment, more supplies to prepare for worst case scenarios?
I think over the years we've improvised a lot with new things, and even the rescue trucks or ambulances of today are way different than when I started just 20 years ago. And I won't say the whole adage, but you can only put 10 pounds of stuff in a 5-pound bag, and it's very difficult to possibly carry every possible thing you're ever going to need. So we try to put just the right quantity of items in the truck that we think will get us by for 1 or 2 patients before we have to go back to the station to restock those things. So, like Dr. Intevi said, we have, tourniquets, let's just say, but that doesn't mean we're going to put 10 on every single truck, because you and I both know they're going to walk. So we have to find the fine line between putting the right equipment on the truck and the right quantity of equipment so that it doesn't walk away and it doesn't take up too much space. Obviously, the hospitals are in much better position to have more supplies because they're a bigger building as opposed to a truck that only has a limited amount of space. So it's a tough question. We just try to balance the items versus the quantity, and it's difficult at times, but I think we do a decent job of putting enough items on the truck to sustain us for 2 or 3 patients, and then after that we're going to have to go stock up again.
Right.
Kevin, I have 2 comments to that. One is that I would focus on front loading again the police officers and SWAT with supplies, first and foremost, and then I would agree with Chief Mosier. I mean, we it wasn't really an issue with the supplies on the rescues at that time. It's just that those supplies needed to be on the front lines and there prior to our arrival, which is what happened that day.
Interesting. So I'll pose my own question to all three of you for planning purposes, realistic worst case scenario. Is there a number? Is it 50? Is it 100? You know, on the Las Vegas Strip, I think there were more casualties in Vegas than there were when the Marine Corps took over Fallujah in Iraq. But you can't plan for 500 gunshot victims realistically. So what's a realistic worst case number? Is it 50? Is it 20? What is it?
I might not be able to give you a number, but I can tell you that whether you're your own department or whether you participate in regional services, there are ways that you can handle that unknown number. In Broward County, we have a lot of regional assets. So departments will participate as a host with certain vehicles. Like we have a regional command post, we have a regional this, we have a regional joint information center. We also have a regional mass casualty incident trailer. And in that trailer is 50 to 100 backboards and headbeds and seat collars and IV supplies and things of that nature. There's an agency that would host that, meaning they just need to make sure that the counts are checked often, but the supply and the trailer and those sorts of things come from regional domestic security task force funds or other UASI funds or things of that nature. So although I can't tell you what a good number is to be prepared for, I can tell you that there are other ways to, you know, even from an equipment standpoint, to be able to prepare yourself for it. It doesn't have to be your own department's responsibility. You know, get with your neighbors and maybe do something jointly with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Boyer, are you unmuted yet? I guess we accidentally.
Yeah.
Okay.
I am. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay. We did get a little feedback in the chat that apparently a lot of hospitals work with 20% of their ED census as a surge number. So ED beds, I guess, plus 20%. At least I think that's what we use here at Stony Brook. So that seems like a reasonable number.
And then the comment I'll make is that I would say this: it all depends on the type of incident. So if you look at the Vegas incident, and in one of our presentations, I have a slide of all the kind of the cell phone dots of all the people who were there and where they all scattered to, right? So imagine like a big rectangle that ended up, people just went everywhere around that rectangle. Whereas in Parkland, there was, you know, one ingress, one egress. We knew where everyone was going to come to, so we were able to set up command where Chief Mosier did, and all the kids that needed to come out came to the right spot. Mm-hmm. It is not practical to think that in a Las Vegas type of incident that you can set up incident command and have people show up to where you are to help treat them. So I think that, you know, one really has to evaluate things like you mentioned earlier, which is PD. Should PD just drive the people? Should Uber and Lyft have bleeding kits in their cars so that they can come in and, you know, someone could push a button and say, all Uber and Lyft drivers start circling the neighborhood and pick up people who are injured. And so the incident we had was vastly different than what they saw in Las Vegas. And again, just for the sheer number of people that had to be treated, and their hospitals did get overwhelmed. They did run out of equipment. Right. And I think that all the things we talked about of having ambulances stationed at those facilities to move out the greens, if you will, to make room for the reds. I think so. I think all those things have to be thought of along with the sheer number of people, but also the type of incident that you're trying to run.
Right. And to really show everyone the extreme that this can go to. I spoke with Dr. Kevin Menace out in Las Vegas a couple of months ago, and he was explaining to me how I think their ED, I think they had 70 beds in their emergency department, of which most were filled. And then in a span of about 50 minutes, they received 200 patients, all with gunshot wounds. And so I cannot even imagine. I just cannot even imagine the stress and the wherewithal that it takes to manage that kind of scene. It's just amazing. And
Yeah.
I liken it to a military adage I used to hear. I didn't invent this line, but I wish I did. And it's slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So when you're in a crisis and you feel like you got to run around like crazy, that's exactly when you need to just slow down a little bit so you don't make mistakes. And they did a pretty amazing job out there in Las Vegas too. And I actually hope to interview them one day as well. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. And I just want to say that you gentlemen have been extraordinarily generous with your time and your willingness to share these experiences. I would like to just grant you all one last parting shot if you have anything for us, and then we can wrap it up. Chief Mosier, any closing arguments?
It's been a pleasure. You and I have been talking for quite some time trying to get this going, and
You've been very patient with me, sir. I appreciate it.
that's okay. And I'm glad you spelled my name right on the final document.
Finally, took me about 5 times.
No, it's our pleasure being here. We want everybody to learn. To Dr. Entevi, you know I love you, man. You've been a great asset to our organization. And I recently, I met Dr. Boyer after this incident because we did some press stuff together. But just a few months ago, when I had a personal issue, I quickly learned that his bedside manner is as amazing in person as it is from what I've heard from some other people. So thank you to him too. But thanks for having us, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Chief. Dr. Entevi,
Yeah.
we'll turn it over to you for a second.
Yeah, I would say that just to echo Chief Mosier that I've matured surely as a person. I've made very, very close friends that have really impacted my life. And I think interestingly, my kids go to school, and I was dropping them off on day one, and next thing you know, I see this guy walking up and dropping off his kid, and it's Dr. Boyer. So it's the community, as much as it was torn apart that one day, has become so much closer. And so you talked about silver linings earlier. There have been very personal and professional silver linings that have made us better as people, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that. And with that, Dr. Boyer, you get the you get to drop the mic, so to speak.
Got it. Chief, I appreciate the kind words, and I think Dr. Entevi summed up our community pretty good. Kevin, this is exactly what we need to do. These type of programs and conferences is what makes the next MCI better. So appreciate you guys' efforts. We just keep sharing our stories, keep learning from one another, and that's how we excel. So thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate those kind words. And we'll this is recorded. It is going to be made available on our website here at Stony Brook, and I'll make sure that you all have the link to that. And I hope that no, I don't hope, I know that people are going to be viewing this quite a bit in the future. So it's a little treasure trove of information that people are going to have access to all the time. And so we'll make sure to get the word out. And in closing, I do, we never mention the names of the assailants, the attackers, but we do need to remember those that we lost, so we never forget them, and we should know their names and we should know their faces. Very, very sad that we lost those 17 people that day, but thanks to all your efforts, we were able to make sure that another 17 got home safely. So that's it. I'd like to thank you all again for everything you offered us today. And I want you all to stay safe and come back and see us on our next interview. So with that, I'll just say thank you and have a wonderful weekend.